Okay, welcome to today's talk on the Babylonian exile and the first creation story. So a little background information here before we get into looking at the Babylonian exile with the help of the text on Genesis by Mary Catherine Berg. We want to look at what was going on in Israel when the exile happened. Well, if we look at the Israelite nation, we can see references to it in historical documents and artifacts back around as early as 1200 BC. So it seems by that time these people who identified themselves as Israelites were flourishing on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. So they kind of existed at this time, seems like a loose confederacy, that they had their identification as other peoples, as other tribes, but then they also saw themselves united as part of a larger Israelite nation. So they had something shared in their identity. And they would help each other fight off other invading tribes. We read stories that reflect that in the Bible. Around 1000 BC, it seems that the kingship was made, that the Israelite tribes adopted a king. And traditionally this is David. Historians debate, biblical scholars and archaeologists are looking at evidence now to see how much of a king David really was, or if he was kind of more of a legendary character to kind of help prop up his son Solomon's dynasty. Regardless, you do see the Israelite tribes being referred to as a kingdom around 1000 BC sometime. Then you had the reign of Solomon within that time, and Solomon is a bona fide historical figure. No historians doubt his historical legitimacy as an actual king who ruled over this area. But Israel as a kingdom didn't last very long, only about 100 years before it split into a north and south. So the north was all the northern tribes, aka every tribe except for Judah and Benjamin, and Simeon, which is kind of included in Judah geographically. But after that split, then you actually have two kingdoms ruling with their own separate kings and understood as two nations in most ways. In 722 BC, then the northern tribes, which were called Israel, they were conquered by the Assyrians, and they kind of disappear. They basically do assimilate into Assyrian culture, although many aspects of the Israelite culture remain among in the conquered areas of northern Israel, even still today. Later on, Judah is conquered by the Babylonians. 587 BC was the date of the second siege of Babylon, and usually taken as the beginning of the exile. So that's where we're stepping in there today to talk about this exile experience when Judah was defeated and many of the Jews were sent into exile by the Babylonians in 587 BC. So the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem twice, one in 598 BC and then later again in 587 BC. So there were kind of two movements in the exile. But during the second siege of Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple. Now the temple was very important. It was the center of the Jewish religious and cultural life. And it came to be known as the only place where you could offer sacrifices to God, which was a major movement in the Jewish and Israelite religious tradition. It was also believed to house the Holy of Holies, it was also believed to house the Shekinah in the Holy of Holies. Now the Shekinah is called the glory of God, and it was the visible sign of God's presence among his people. So it was housed in the back of the temple, and no one could go in there to see it because it was so holy. It was believed he really couldn't handle it. Only the high priest would go in there once a year, let it shine on his face, and then he'd come out and let the glory of God reflect off of his face onto the people. So it was a sign of the unity of the nation and the center of the religious and cultural life. So it was a big deal, we'll see, when it was destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar then took control of Judah, and he exiled the Jews from Judah, right? People from Judah, that's what Jews means in this case, or at that time. And he exiled them, not all of them. When one country conquers another and doesn't exile, they don't usually exile everybody. But he exiled people who might be influential in a revolt. People like landowners, people who were related to the royal family, people who had lots of money, people who were skilled artisans and laborers, amongst others. Scribes, educated people, people who knew how to write and read. These various groups who were kind of leadership in some way of the Jewish communities. They were taken to live in Babylon. Now, things were not that bad for them in Babylon. Compared to some other groups they could have been conquered by, like the Assyrians who conquered the north, the Babylonians didn't treat the Jews very badly in exile. They kind of just brought them in and let them live in relative freedom with the hope that they would assimilate and just basically then turn into Babylonians. Good move, right? Less of the people you conquer, more of you. So what was it like for Jews living in Babylon in the early exile period? Well, actually, in a lot of ways, most of them did better than they had in Judah. They had better farmland to work with. They had a nice skill set. I mean, you had people who were living in Judah. They kind of knew how to live off the land. But in Babylon, they had more water. They were less susceptible to famine. It was also safer there. They didn't have to worry about marauders invading their villages and towns as much because the capital city of Babylon kind of offered protection from those things. So it was kind of a good life, and most of the Jews did very well, or at least a lot better than they had done in Judah during the exile. Of course, living there with the Babylonians, they were exposed to the Babylonian culture, language, and religious life. Many of the Jews started to speak Aramaic, Babylonian language that was not far from their native tongue. So, I mean, it kind of looks like the Babylonian idea would work. You know, they're here, they're living with the Babylonians, things are going nicely. You would expect them to assimilate within a couple generations, as typically happens. Okay, so life was kind of good for the Jews in exile in Babylon. What were they missing? Well, a couple important parts of their identity. Number one, the temple. As I already mentioned, it was the center of their religious and cultural life. It was the place that they really thought they had a specific connection with God on earth, and they believed that it would last forever. The other thing they were missing was the land, their own land, their own country, their land that was promised to them by God. And they thought that this was supposed to be a forever promise, right? In their stories, foundational stories, God promises the land to Abraham and his descendants forever. And so they thought, that was given to them from God and it would never be taken away. So they had to answer the question. That was a big question that plagued them. Why did they lose their land? This land that God had promised their ancestors when they were supposed to have it forever. Again, it kind of looks like things are lining up in a way that, hey, well, the Jews are probably just going to assimilate and become nice Babylonians, right? Well, what happens?